Well, we're going to start a journey this morning with a new sermon series, and Trish texted me this week. She had my title and such, but she said, this is a new series. What's the name of this new series? I said, well, I was really going to call it A Look to the Future, but maybe we ought to call it Back to the Future. In either way, we're going to take a look at what some of the different biblical individuals have to say about the future, what indeed is to come. You know, there was an enjoyable movie some years ago by the title Back to the Future, starring Michael J. Fox, in which he, by virtue of a time machine, went 20 years back in time. And there he was in a setting, learning how his parents came to meet each other and meeting people that he knew from a future event and watching all these things and in some ways manipulating these things. But at some point he realized he needed to get back into the future. And so the future has always been something that has been remarkable and an object of curiosity to so many. I mean, let's face it. There are people who try to predict the future. Sometimes they do this through dreams and visions of their own speculations. Sometimes they do this through their own biblical interpretation, and they come up with all kinds of interpretations. And you know the story historically. There have been all kinds of people that have tried to identify different events and places and times and predict the time when they think the world is going to come to an end. So far, none of those have really panned out, although I will admit a number of years ago there was one guy who seemed pretty convincing. It was just about this time of year, and he predicted that the world was going to end. I think it was on October 1st or something like that. And I did withhold my third quarter income tax until I made sure that date was going to pass. I thought, what's the use of sending that in, you know, if this guy might know what he's talking about. But he didn't. So the passage we're going to look at today is Matthew 24 and 25. We can't read all of that. It's a lengthy passage. You might at a later time want to look through Matthew 24, get the whole context of that. But in this passage, we have what is known as Jesus' Olivet Discourse, where he does a glimpse into the future. And the Bible, when it talks about the future, is a little bit of a mixed bag, or a little bit of a mixed message. And it's a mixed message in this sense. There are certain themes and certain events, certain major kinds of themes and ideas that are lifted up with certainty that we should be prepared for. But then at the same time, it takes caution, specifically in terms of specific dates and specific times. And it actually gives warnings about trying to identify specific events or specific dates or specific times. And yet when we look through the Bible, we're going to look over these next few weeks at some of the passages of Paul and Paul's understanding of the future. We're going to look at John and John's understanding of the future. But today I specifically want to look just briefly at Jesus and Jesus' understanding of the future. What does Jesus teach us about the future? Now, again, this is a lengthy passage, 24 and 25. We cannot go into this in great detail. I'm just going to be lifting up some general points and principles this message. But there are at least three things that I think are very, very clear from these two passages this morning, or these two chapters of the Bible. First of all, there are certain things, some things that Jesus wants us clearly to know. As one writer has said, the Bible is not a book of enigmas or puzzles or conundra. The Bible is a book of clarity. The Bible is a book of revelation. There are certain things that we need to know, and Jesus wants us to know. And generally speaking, when we look at verses 4 through 8, and then go on through this passage, we see three kind of main events. One is just what is known as a period of general tribulation. This is just the tribulation or the trials that Christians have had all through the centuries. Beginning in the very first century, there are wars and rumors of war. There are persecutions. There are people arrested and taken into prison. There are people who are martyred for the faith. You know, and I was thinking back to this day when Jesus was visiting with the disciples and giving them this word, and I thought to themselves, this must have been real encouraging for them to tell them that as you go through this life, there are going to be trials and tribulations. And that's going to be true for the saints of God throughout the stages of history. There are going to be times of upset and trial, what we call general trials and tribulations. But then he goes on a little bit later, specifically in verses 15 and following, and he starts speaking of a very specific time, towards the end of time. These other events, he said, are sort of like birth pangs. In fact, he uses that term. It's a lot like a woman in labor. And when the birth pangs start, they start out kind of mild. But as they progress, as the birth of the child grows near, the birth pangs become more frequent, they come closer in nature, and they become more intense. And that is sort of the picture of history that Jesus is pointing us to here. As we go throughout history, these trials and tribulations will become more frequent, a more common occurrence. And they will become more intense until it leads up to a time of what he calls, or what some refer to as, the Great Tribulation. This is a time, he says, of distress in verse 21. A time of great tribulation in some translations, or great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never will be equaled again. So somewhere towards the climax of history, he is letting us know that there's going to be a time of great tribulation that's going to be unequaled before history, as unto history, that's going to come upon the world. So there is trouble coming for the world. And yet, he says, lift up your hearts, because verses 27 to 31, he said the climax of history is not going to be our own self-destruction or this great tribulation or the trials that come upon us, but the climax of history is going to be the glorious return of our Lord. In fact, he says, don't get upset if someone gives you word that somehow this event has already happened, or the coming of the Son of Man has already taken place. But he says, at that time the Son of the Man will appear in the sky, and all the peoples of the earth will mourn, and the clouds will hope, and the heaven will open with his glorious return, with all the angels and the trumpet call. So the climax of history will be with this glorious return of Christ. And in this kind of general scheme or understanding that Christ is lifting up before us, he's trying to give us a comfort, even though he's telling us that there's going to be hardships and tribulations in this world. But he's trying to assure to us that history is his story, that our life, our world, our destiny, the purpose and the final destiny of this earth is in the hands of God. And one day history will find its climax in his story. I remember when my father was alive, he told the story of when he was a child, going to church with his mother, my grandmother, and there was a Bible evangelist that came and did a series on Revelation, and he said he had charts and all kinds of pictures and stuff like that. And my dad said the outcome for him was that he was scared to death. I mean, he said it literally scared him to death. And sometimes we can get into these themes in such a way that it does scare us to death. But even in the book of Revelation and some of these passages where there is very graphic language, the emphasis is on the protection and comfort of the saints of God, that God has got our back. That as we go throughout history, God is with us. And if we go through fire, he is with us in the fiery furnace. And he is the one who's going to be with us in the face of any danger or trial that we might come. And that ultimately the goal and destiny of our life is that we will be reunited with him. So Jesus said there are some things we should clearly know. It's kind of a broad picture. But we get a kind of an idea of the course of history and how it's going to flow. But then he says there are some things that we clearly should not know, or clearly we will not know. And specifically, he's talking about the day and the hour of the Lord's return. And he says, regarding this day and this hour of the Lord's return, no one knows that. Not even the angels in heaven or the Son knows the day when the Lord is going to return. And so given these clear words, why some people continue to speculate and try to find dates and try to find years and try to figure this all out, I really don't know. But he gives this kind of emphasis that we need to be ready. Because the fact of the matter is, we don't know when this is going to happen. And he gives basically three illustrations. In verses 37 to 39, he says it's sort of like in the days of Noah. And you know, it's kind of interesting, in the days of Noah, even though Noah prepared himself, there were many that just scoffed at him. They said, what is he doing building this boat? They didn't really think that any kind of disaster or any kind of trial was going to come on the earth until the rains began to fall. And then they realized, maybe this guy really kind of knew what he was talking about. It's going to come suddenly, but they should have been prepared. He says in verses 40 and 41, it's like two in the field, or two grinding at the mill, and one is taken and one is left. And the emphasis on the sudden and unexpectedness of the event of the Lord's return. And then in verse 43 and 44, he says it's going to be like a thief. In fact, he says, if someone had known the thief was coming, they would have prepared themselves. They would have been up watching and waiting for the thief to come. But the fact of the matter is, sometimes we are unprepared. But in verse 42, he gives this stern warning. He says, watch, be on guard. Pay attention. Our eyes and our hearts and our minds and our spirits should be focused on and looking forward to this glorious return. We don't know when it's going to happen. But given the fact that we don't know when the Lord's going to come, we should be ready. We should be preparing ourselves. Several years ago, when my mother's brother, Uncle Newell, was still alive, he had the unfortunate event. He had a separated garage at his house, and someone broke into that garage one evening. And out there he had a whole lot of tools and a whole lot of equipment, and they took a whole lot of that equipment and he discovered in the morning and called the police, and they came out and studied, and then they found all of a sudden a wheelbarrow out beside his house had been turned over onto its top, and they lifted that up and there was a generator on there. And they said what appears to happen was they were starting to take this generator out, and they must have gotten interrupted. They got disrupted, and so they put that wheelbarrow on top of that generator, and the police said, they're probably going to come back and try to get that generator. You need to get it back in your garage and get the door fixed and get the lock fixed and all that type of stuff. My Uncle Newell, he was just, a different type of, he said, leave it right there. He said, just leave it right there and leave it covered up, and I'll be waiting for them. And lo and behold, he stayed up, I think, for the next 3 nights, almost all night long. What he was really going to do if he caught those guys, I don't know. But he stayed up watching for them, waiting for them. He said, I'm just waiting for them to come back and get that generator. Well, you can only do that for so long, and you finally have to get on with your life. And I think after about the 3rd night, he gave up and he put it back in the garage and got the door fixed and got a lock on it and went on with his life. But the point is, if we really knew when certain events, like a thief was going to come or a robber was going to come, how wonderful that would be. We'd just be there in waiting for them. We would just be there to capture the moment, but we don't. And so the theme that Jesus is lifting up to the disciples and to us is that we need to be prepared at every season of our life. We need to be prepared at every stage of our life. We need to be prepared at every course of history. Because literally every generation of the church might be the generation when the Lord returns. We really don't know when He's going to come. But we as individuals and we as the church are to be prepared and living our life in light of that promise that our Lord is going to return. And so there's some things that are very clear that we should do. Some of these go on into chapter 25, but they tell us a little bit about how we should live. We should keep our lamps burning. There's some parables given in chapter 25. One is about some virgins, 10 virgins, each of which had lamps, and they were going to go out to meet the bridegroom. But when they heard the bridegroom was coming, they were on their way out, and 5 of them had failed to have enough oil to keep the lamps burning. They had to go off and try to find some oil, but alas, the bridegroom came and they missed him. And so Jesus is telling the emphasis to us, keep the fires of your life burning, the passion of your spiritual life. This is not a time for our hearts to grow cold. This is not a time for us to become lackadaisical in our Christian commitment. This is not a time for us to be slack in our efforts to win others to the faith and bring them into the community of faith. This is a time for us to keep the fires burning. This is a time for us to stoke the Spirit within us and allow that Spirit to reign and flow, and to be passionate and energized about our faith and about our love for Christ and about all that we share for God. He goes on in verses 14 to 30 and talks about using our gifts. And again, he gives another parable about some people that were given gifts, and one of them especially buried his gift under the sand or in the dirt, and he thought, well, at least that way I won't lose it. And Jesus is saying that's not the way we're to live our life. God has given us gifts that are like a stewardship to us. They've been entrusted to us. We should use our gifts in every way that we can to serve God. We're to be out trying to use the gifts and be good stewards of everything that God has entrusted to us. And then he goes on in verses 31 to 46 and talks about serving others as we would Christ. And he gives a very interesting parable about reaching out to those who are lost and outcast and visiting people in prisons and offering cups of water to those who are thirsty and just living a general spirit of outreach and kindness in every kind of way. And he tells a story of a day when there are some who are commended for these efforts. And Jesus talks about how we offered that kindness unto him. And the disciples said, when did we see you lonely and in prison? When did we see you hungry or naked or thirsty? And Jesus said, when you did it to the least of one of these, you did it to me. That there's a way in which we minister now to a hurting and a watching and a longing world. We are like ministering unto Christ. We are serving Christ. We are being the hands and the feet of Christ. And during this time, as we await for his coming, that's what we are to do. And so again, the emphasis is on we should be prepared. We should prepare ourselves fully to be the servants for Christ that he calls us to be. You know, I was amazed after my mother's death when I started going through her business affairs, and I knew some of this even while she was still living, that all of the things she had set in order in anticipation for that time, wills and living wills and trusts and instructions and details of instructions for me and on and on and on. And it was so helpful to me, but it was clear to me that she knew there was going to come a time when her final days on this earth were going to go and she was going to pass. And she wanted to ensure that for me and others who were making steps and following up on that she had made as many preparations as possible to make that an easy journey for us. We need to be in preparation, not only for our own death, but also for the Lord's return. We need to be preparing ourselves in every way that we can. Not so much in death, but maybe this happens at your house. Do you ever find out that company's coming? And all of a sudden, certain members of the family, usually the wife, spring into action. And that is true with Christy. I'll just tell you, when we find out that company is coming, the living room gets picked up and the dining room gets straightened out and things get vacuumed and the bathrooms get cleaned. And if there's time, the lawn gets mowed and the hedges gets trimmed and on and on and on, because she is getting ready for the arrival of guests into the home. And in the same manner, in the same way, Jesus is saying we should be preparing for the return of our Lord as a wonderful guest coming into our life, coming into our world. Our life should be in order. Our family should be in order. It doesn't mean our house has to be perfectly spotless when Jesus returns, but he's speaking more about the manner of our life and the way that we are relating to people and the issues of life. And sometimes people have this kind of bucket list, usually of things they want to do before the end of their life comes. Well, sometimes there's a kind of a relational bucket list. Sometimes there's kind of a spiritual bucket list. Sometimes there's things about our heart, about our mindset, about our relationships, things which we regret, or other matters that we've wanted to do, letters we've wanted to write, or words we've wanted to speak. And Jesus is saying in general, we need to put our life in order. We need to be preparing our life for this time when our Lord returns. And so he says, be prepared. Live your life in anticipation of Christ's return. It's not something we need to fear, but it's something we need to be ready about. And we need not fear the future. In fact, I think it's in Proverbs, it talks about those who are able to smile on the future. We know not what tomorrow might bring. Jesus encourages us not to worry, but he encourages us to put our life in his hands, to trust in him fully, to keep our hearts guarded and ready, and to always anticipate the celebration of his return, and know that it might come any day, even though we don't know the time of the day or the hour. Who knows? Only the Father in heaven. But our goal is to live each day fully as unto him. Thanks be to God.